The clock on the wall read 4:17 in the afternoon. 17 minutes ago, Callum Rourke had officially become an adult. 17 minutes ago, Callum Rourke had officially become homeless. The office smelled like bleach and burnt coffee, and something else underneath both of those things, something stale and defeated that no amount of cleaning could fully scrub away. Mrs. Donahue, the facility supervisor, slid a manila envelope across her particle board desk without looking up from her paperwork. She had the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this exact motion hundreds of times. The envelope landed in front of him with a soft final sound. Inside were three things: his birth certificate, his social security card, a check for $127. "Happy birthday, Callum," she said. "Good luck out there." He picked up the envelope and folded it into the back pocket of his jeans. He had rehearsed this moment in his head for months. He had told himself he would feel something big when it finally came, relief maybe, or anger, or the particular dizzy freedom of a door swinging open. What he actually felt was nothing. A clean, hollow nothing, like a room after all the furniture has been carried out. He shouldered his bag. It was an old canvas duffel, dark green and worn at the seams, and it contained everything he owned in the world. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a wool sweater he'd found in a donation box 3 winters ago and never gave back, a paperback book with the spine cracked so many times the cover barely held, a photograph tucked between the pages, his mother and father standing in front of a blue car, squinting into summer sunlight, from a time when they still looked like people who had reasons to smile. He walked down the long hallway toward the front entrance. The linoleum floors were the color of old mustard, and they creaked in the same spots they always had. He had walked this hallway for 2 years. He knew every sound it made. Behind the door of the common room, he could hear Wren. She was talking to one of the younger kids, her voice low and patient, the way she always was with children who were scared. She was 15 years old, his little sister, and she had a gift for making people feel like the world wasn't as sharp-edged as it actually was. He stood outside the door for a moment and listened to the sound of her voice and felt the hollow nothing inside him start to fill with something else entirely, something harder and colder and more urgent. He pushed open the door. Wren looked up from the corner where she was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her sketchbook open on her lap, a younger girl beside her watching Wren's pencil move. Wren had dark eyes set wide in a narrow face, and when she looked at him, she read him the way she always read him, completely immediately, without him having to say a single word. "Is it time?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah." She closed the sketchbook and stood up in one smooth motion, tucking it under her arm. She said something quiet and kind to the little girl beside her, and then she came to him, and they walked together toward the front of the building. At the entrance, Mrs. Donahue was waiting with one more thing. "Almost forgot," she said, holding out a cardboard box the size of a shoebox sealed with tape that had gone yellow with age. "This came for you last week. Your old caseworker forwarded it from your previous placement. Said it was from your grandfather, something he left behind a long time ago." Callum took the box. It was heavier than it looked. Not dramatically heavy, not the kind of heavy that announces itself, but there was a solid, purposeful weight to it that registered in his palms and his forearms, the weight of something real and intentional. He had not thought about his grandfather Desmond in a long time. He had a child's memory of the man-wide, rough hands that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, a voice that was unhurried and low, a way of explaining things that made even complicated things feel manageable. Desmond Rourke had died when Callum was 10 years old, and after that, everything had started going wrong in the slow, grinding way that feels inevitable only in hindsight. He tucked the box under his arm. They stood on the front steps in the late afternoon gray. The city stretched out before them, cracked sidewalks, a bus stop with a broken bench, a gas station on the corner with one pump taped off with a plastic bag. 2 blocks down, a woman was arguing into a cell phone, her voice carrying in the cold air. A pigeon was eating something on the curb that Callum didn't look at closely. This was the world, their world now, with no intermediary. His phone showed a voicemail from Ms. Cornelia Ashford, their caseworker. She had called 4 times in the last hour. She would have already been notified about Wren's scheduled transfer to the Millhaven facility, a higher security placement 40 miles north for teenagers with what the state called complex family histories, which was the bureaucratic way of saying children nobody had figured out what to do with. The transfer was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. A driver was already assigned. Callum looked at his sister. She was watching the street with that composed expression she had developed over the last 2 years. The face she put on in public, the one that gave nothing away. But he knew her. He had shared rooms with her and whispered conversations in the dark with her, and navigated every corner of this system beside her, and he knew that behind the composed expression, she was terrified. He was not going to let them put her on that van. The decision did not feel reckless. It felt like the only thing that made sense in a situation where nothing else did, the one fixed point in a landscape that kept shifting. He had no plan beyond the decision itself. He had $127, a canvas bag of worn clothing, a cardboard box from a dead man, and a sister who trusted him in a way he had done nothing to earn and everything to try to deserve. "Come on," he said. "You're coming with me." Her eyes went wide for just a moment. "But they said—" "I know what they said." She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she took his hand. They ran for the bus. The emergency shelter on Clement Street was the kind of place that stripped the last of your illusions about the world being basically fair. The air inside smelled of industrial cleaner and something biological underneath it, and the sound never fully stopped. A television bolted high on a wall playing a game show. No one was watching a man in the far corner coughing in long rhythmic spasms. A baby somewhere beyond the partition that cried and stopped and cried again at intervals that seemed designed to prevent sleep. They were given 2 cots in a large open room. Callum put his duffel bag on the floor between them and sat on the edge of his cot and looked at the cracked ceiling and thought about the 9 o'clock van. By now, Ms. Ashford would have been notified that Wren had not reported for transport. By now, there would be a system flag. By tomorrow morning, there would be calls to police departments and a missing persons report. Callum was legally an adult. Taking a minor from state custody, even a minor who was his own sister, had a legal name. He had looked it up once on a library computer, curious in the abstract way you examine your own possible futures. The legal name was not a comfortable one. He was aware of all of this. He was choosing it anyway. Wren sat across from him, her sketchbook open, her pencil moving in small, careful strokes. She had been drawing since she could hold a pencil. It was the thing that had kept her sane through all of it. The moves, the uncertainty, the institutional sameness of one placement after another. She drew the world around her, and by drawing it, she made it hers. He watched her work and felt a complicated thing in his chest that was equal parts love and guilt, and a fierce protective anger that had nowhere useful to go. "What's in the box?" she asked without looking up. He had almost forgotten he was holding it. He set it on the cot between them. The tape was stiff and resistant, and he worked at it with his thumbnail, careful not to tear whatever was inside. The cardboard was soft with age in a way that felt almost organic, like the box had absorbed something of the years it had been sitting wherever it had been sitting. He lifted the lid. Inside, nested in yellow tissue paper, were 3 objects. The first was a locket, small and silver, oval-shaped, worn smooth on the edges from years of handling. He pressed the small clasp, and it opened without resistance. On one side was a photograph so small and faded, it took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. 2 young people, a man and a woman, standing in bright light, with their faces turned toward each other rather than the camera. He recognized his grandfather's jaw and the particular way he held his shoulders. The woman beside him was his grandmother, dead before Callum was born. On the other side of the locket, where a second photograph might have been there, was instead an engraving, tiny and precise, a single oak tree, its roots as deep and wide as its branches. The second object was a key, not a modern key. This was something older and more deliberate, forged from iron rather than stamped from aluminum, heavier than any key he had ever held, with a long shaft and an ornate circular head and a complex arrangement of teeth along the bit that looked less like something for a lock and more like a piece of engineering. It was cold in his palm in the way that metal holds cold, and it had a small, satisfied weight that made you want to close your hand around it. On the head of the key, worked into the iron with what must have been enormous care, was the same design as the locket of tree roots and branches in equal measure. He turned it over in his fingers, said nothing. The third object was a sheet of paper, thick and cream-colored, folded into a small square. He unfolded it carefully, his fingers registering the quality of it. This was not notebook paper, not a torn page from a legal pad. This was the kind of paper someone chooses deliberately when they intend what they are writing to last. It was a map. Hand-drawn in black ink, the lines confident and unhurried as his grandfather had done everything. It showed a stretch of landscape contour lines suggesting hills rising steeply, a winding creek that split into two branches, a series of landmarks noted in small, precise annotations. A rock formation labeled in two words. A single tree marked with a specific detail. Compass directions in the corners drawn freehand, but accurate looking. A scale in the bottom left corner. At the top of the map in the handwriting Callum had last seen on birthday cards when he was 9 years old were two words. For Callum. And in the bottom right corner, a small red X. Wren had stopped drawing. She was leaning forward looking at the map with her wide dark eyes, and for a moment the sound of the shelter fell away entirely. The television, the coughing, the crying, and there was only the two of them, and the map, and the key, and the dead man's handwriting on cream-colored paper. "What is it?" she said. "I think it's a place," Callum said slowly. "A place he wanted me to find." He sat with that for a long moment. He turned the key over in his fingers again and looked at the tree worked into its head and thought about his grandfather's hands, the size of them, the patience in them, the way they had moved over wood and metal and soil with a certainty that Callum had not understood as a child, but understood now as something rare and worth grieving. Desmond Rourke had been a carpenter and a craftsman who had spent his life in the Blue Ridge foothills of Virginia. He had built things, furniture that lasted, outbuildings that stood straight, a workshop behind his house that smelled of cedar and machine oil, and the specific productive quiet of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He had not been a fanciful man. He had not been the kind of man who left cryptic messages for dramatic effect. If he had drawn a map and forged a key and left them in a box for his grandson, he had done it for a reason that was as practical and considered as everything else he had ever done. Callum looked at his phone. The shelter around them was settling into its nighttime sounds, the particular exhausted quiet of a place full of people trying to sleep through their circumstances. He had $40 left on a prepaid card. He had the check for $127 not yet cashed. He had nowhere to go in the morning that wasn't a dead end. He took out the check and looked at it. Then he looked at the map. In the bottom corner beside the red X, there was a tiny notation he had missed on first reading a place name written so small it was nearly invisible. Two words, Grover's Mill. He typed it into his phone. Grover's Mill, Virginia. Population 412. Located in the Blue Ridge foothills, Rockbridge County. A bus route ran there from the city, one departure 6 in the morning, arriving late afternoon with 2 transfers. The fare was $43 per ticket. He looked at Wren. She looked back at him with an expression that was entirely steady, entirely without panic. The expression of someone who has learned through long practice to wait for information before reacting to it. That steadiness, that patience, it had always been more hers than his. She was 15, and she had more composure than he had ever managed at any age. "There's a bus at 6, he said. "It goes to a town in Virginia, Blue Ridge Country. That's where this map leads." A pause. "How much for 86 for both of us? I have enough." She looked at the map again, then at the key, then at him. "Okay," she said. He nodded. That was enough. That was all. They did not sleep. They lay on their cots in the close dark of the shelter. The map spread between them like a shared secret, and they waited for the hours to pass. Callum had learned in 2 years of institutional living that waiting was a skill like any other, that you could learn to inhabit it, rather than fight it to let the time move through you rather than pressing against it. He lay on his back and stared at the water-stained ceiling and listened to the building breathe around them and thought about his grandfather. He had not let himself think about Desmond in a long time. Grief, he had learned early, was something you could choose to set down. Not forever, not cleanly, but you could put it somewhere and not look at it and get through the days. Now in the dark of the shelter with the key lying heavy on his chest, where he held it, he let himself remember. He remembered the workshop, the smell of it, the feeling of stepping through the door from the ordinary world into a place that had its own rules and its own logic, where things were made rather than consumed. He remembered standing beside his grandfather at the workbench and being shown, not told, shown how a piece of wood had a grain to it, a direction, a way it wanted to be worked, and how fighting that was always slower and harder than finding it and going with it. He remembered the weight and balance of a hand plane in his small hands the first time he was trusted with one. He remembered how it felt to make a thing. He had been 10 years old the last time he stood in that workshop. 3 months later, Desmond was gone. 6 months after that, his father's debts had become impossible to hide, and his parents' marriage had become impossible to sustain, and everything that had felt solid in his life had come apart in the particular way that childhood certainties come apart, not all at once but in pieces, each one painful until one day you look up and none of it is left. He had not made anything with his hands since. At 5 in the morning, he sat up and gathered their things. Wren was already awake, already sitting up, already watching him. He did not ask if she was ready. She was. She always was. They left the shelter before the morning staff came on shift and walked 6 blocks through pre-dawn streets to the bus station. The city at that hour had a particular quality emptied out honestly itself. The lights of late-night convenience stores reflecting on wet pavement, the occasional figure moving through the cold air, with the purposeful quiet of someone who belongs to the night. Callum walked with his duffel over one shoulder and the cardboard box under his arm, and Wren walked beside him with her sketchbook and her single bag and her pencil tucked behind her ear. The bus station smelled of stale air and old coffee. He cashed the check at a machine that charged $8 for the service and bought 2 one-way tickets to Grover's Mill. The woman behind the counter didn't look at them. To her, they were 2 more early morning travelers, unremarkable, interchangeable, with every other pair of people passing through. He was grateful for that. He intended to stay unremarkable for as long as possible. They bought coffee and pastries from a vending machine, mediocre expensive, the best available, and sat on plastic chairs and waited. "Are you scared?" Wren asked. He thought about lying, decided against it. "Yeah," he said. "A little." She nodded as though this was the right answer. "Me too," she said. "But I was more scared back there. Of the van. Of being—" She paused. "Of being somewhere without you." He didn't have anything useful to say to that, so he said nothing. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, and they sat like that until the bus came. The journey south took most of the day. 2 transfers, once at a regional hub, where they had 40 minutes to sit in another plastic chair, in another waiting room, once at a smaller depot, where the bus they needed was already idling, already boarding, barely enough time to move from one to the other without running. The landscape changed as they went, the city giving way to sprawl, the sprawl giving way to farmland, the farmland eventually giving way to something older and more textured, the land beginning to rise and fold around them as the Blue Ridge foothills came into view. Callum sat by the window for most of the trip and studied the map. He had taken a photograph of it on his phone, zoomed in on the annotations, tried to understand the language of it. His grandfather had marked landmarks in a way that was practical rather than poetic, specific observable features rather than named locations. Where 2 streams meet and divide, a formation of gray limestone he called the resting stone. A lone pine with a specific deformity struck by lightning. At some point in its history, its trunk torqued into a permanent spiral, still living, still growing, just growing differently than it was designed to grow. And from that twisted pine, the X. He studied the compass markings, studied the contour lines. He had never been trained to read topographic maps, but the logic of them was not complicated once you understood that each line meant a consistent elevation, and the closer the lines were together, the steeper the terrain. He traced the likely route with his finger on the phone screen and committed what he could to memory. Wren slept for 2 hours with her head against his shoulder. He did not move. He sat very still and let her sleep and watched the hills grow around them through the window and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time direction. Not certainty, not safety, nothing as comfortable as either of those. Just the specific quality of moving towards something rather than away from it. Purpose. Even if the purpose was built on a dead man's map in a box that came from nowhere, it was something. The bus pulled into Grover's Mill at 4:30 in the afternoon. They were the only passengers to get off. The town was small enough that calling it a town at all was generous. A single main intersection, a hardware store with a hand-painted sign, and a wooden porch that ran the full width of the front. A post office the size of a large shed. A church with a marquee sign out front and an American flag that needed replacing. A cluster of houses set back from the road, modest and neat, the kind of houses where people have lived for generations and don't feel the need to announce themselves. Beyond the buildings in every direction, the hills rose steeply, heavily forested, the trees just beginning to show the first hesitant colors of early fall. A man was sweeping the porch of the hardware store. He was in his 60s, compact and weathered, wearing canvas work pants and a flannel shirt and a hat with a seed company logo on it. He watched them step off the bus with the untroubled attention of a man who has lived his whole life in a small town and is therefore genuinely interested in anything that interrupts the ordinary. Callum crossed the street. "Excuse me," he said. "We're looking for a piece of land. My grandfather owned it. He passed away a while back. He left a map." He unfolded the photograph on his phone and held it out. The man took the phone. He held it close to his face and looked at the map for a long moment. His expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible from any distance, but up close, standing directly in front of him, Callum could see it. A flicker of recognition, something that moved through the weathered face like a cloud passing over still water. "Where'd you get this?" the man said. "He left it for me, in a box. I just found it today." The man looked up from the phone. He looked at Callum with a long, evaluating look, not hostile, not suspicious exactly, but the look of someone deciding something. Then he handed the phone back. "That's Desmond Rourke's work," he said. "I'd know that hand anywhere. Amos Whitfield." He extended a calloused hand and Callum shook it. "I knew your grandfather. Not well, but well enough to know he was a serious man who didn't do things without a reason." He looked at Wren, who had come to stand beside Callum, then back at Callum. "You two come from the city?" "Yes, sir." A pause. Amos Whitfield looked at the hills to the east. "The land Desmond owned is up on the ridge. 10 acres, give or take. He bought it in pieces over about 15 years, paid cash each time I know, because my cousin handled 2 of the transactions. There's an access road off the county route about a mile east of here. It's not much of a road anymore." He paused again. "Nobody's been up there since he died. That was, what, 8 years ago?" 8 years, Callum confirmed. Whitfield nodded slowly. "I'll tell you how to get to the access road. But it's a long walk up that ridge and it gets dark fast this time of year, once the sun drops behind the mountains." "You sure about this?" "Yes, sir," Callum said. The old man looked at him for another long moment. Then something in his face settled, some final calculation completing itself, and he nodded once, definitive. "All right, let me get you some water and something to eat first. You've got the look of people who haven't had a proper meal today." They didn't argue. Amos Whitfield's hardware store was one of those places that seemed to have been slowly accumulating their contents for so long that the accumulation has become part of the architecture, coils of rope and chain hanging from ceiling hooks. Bins of fasteners organized in a system that made sense only to someone who had designed it themselves. The particular museum-like quality of tools arranged not for display, but for use. It smelled of machine oil and old wood, and the specific dusty warmth of a building that has been heated with wood fires for many decades. He gave them water in real glasses and sandwiches. He made himself in a small back room, thick bread and sliced meat and mustard, nothing elaborate exactly sufficient. He did not ask them questions while they ate, which was its own kind of kindness. He moved around his store, sweeping, reorganizing, doing the small tasks of closing up for the day and let them eat in peace. When they were done, he told them how to find the access road. Follow the county route east, he said. Look for a stand of white birches on the left side. You can't miss them. They're the only birches on that stretch of road. The access road begins just past them, goes into the trees. It's overgrown. You'll see it if you know to look. He paused. Follow the ridge road until it ends, then follow the creek north. Everything else. He nodded toward the map on Callum's phone. Your grandfather laid out for you. He walked them to the door. On the porch, he stopped. He was a careful man, your grandfather, Amos Whitfield said. Not to both of them, to Callum specifically, with the directness of one man addressing another. The kind of careful that other people sometimes mistake for coldness. But it wasn't coldness. It was just he thought things through. A long way through. Whatever he left up on that ridge, he left it because he thought it all the way to the end. He held Callum's gaze for a moment. You understand what I'm saying? Callum said he did. Good. Whitfield stuck out his hand again. Go find what he left you. They walked east on the county route in the long golden light of late afternoon. The road was quiet. A truck passed them, going the other direction, slowing slightly as the driver looked at them, then continuing on. The mountains rose around them, the forested slopes throwing long shadows across the valley floor, the light catching the highest ridge lines and making them glow. It was beautiful in the indifferent way of wild places, the beauty that asks nothing from you and offers no comfort, but is there all the same. They found the birches. They found the access road. It was exactly as Whitfield had described, a pair of ruts nearly swallowed by vegetation. The grass down the center stripe grown high enough to brush their knees, but the ruts themselves still present and firm under the overgrowth. The tree line closed around them as they entered the woods, the light dropping and cooling, the sound of the road disappearing behind them. The forest smelled of damp soil and decaying leaves and something else, something green and alive and very old. The access road climbed. It was not gentle. The grade increased steadily as they moved higher onto the ridge, and the ruts grew more difficult to follow as the vegetation thickened. Callum went first, clearing branches when he needed to, reading the ground for the most solid footing. Wren followed close behind her bag across her back, her sketchbook under her arm, moving through the difficult terrain with a grace that surprised him until he remembered that she had always been more physical than she looked. After an hour, they found the creek. It ran clear over smooth gray rocks, narrow enough to step across in most places, the sound of it steady and low. They followed it north as Whitfield had directed, and the going was harder here. The bank was steep in places, thick with fern and rhododendron, forcing them to scramble. Callum's shoes were soaked through within the first 10 minutes. He studied the map at each landmark. The resting stone, a low shelf of gray limestone jutting from the hillside flat on top, the size of a dining table streaked with lichen, present, exactly as drawn. The point where the creek divided into two smaller streams running down the hillside in parallel channels, before rejoining lower down, present, exactly as drawn. He stood at the fork and felt something move through him, a faint electrical thing, not quite excitement, something quieter and more serious than excitement. This was real. The map was real. His grandfather had walked this exact ground and noted these exact features and drawn them with his careful hands, and now Callum was here on the same ground following the same logic. He kept moving. The light was failing now, the sky above the tree canopy going from blue to orange to a deep clear gray. The temperature dropped with the light, and Callum's breath was visible in the air ahead of him. Wren had stopped talking, not from exhaustion, he thought, but from the same quality of focused attention that had come over him. They were close. He could feel it in the way you feel a destination approaching before you can see it. And then he saw the pine. It was immediately recognizable from the map's description. Large old, its trunk torqued into a left-hand spiral where lightning had struck it decades ago, still living, still pushing new growth upward from its damaged architecture. It stood at the edge of a small natural clearing, the clearing itself no more than 40 feet across the forest, pressing close on every side. He looked at the map. From the twisted pine, the notation read, 30 paces due north. Look down. He took 30 paces due north, counting carefully. Stopped, looked down. The forest floor was carpeted in pine needles and leaves, brown and deep, undisturbed looking. He crouched and began to feel through the surface layer with his hands. The needles were cold and damp. Beneath them, the soil was dark and soft. And then his fingers found the edge of something. Not soil, not stone, metal. He cleared the needles away with both hands, working in expanding circles, and the shape beneath his hands revealed itself a steel plate, roughly 3 feet by 4 feet. The edges sunk flush into the earth, the surface covered in a patina of rust and soil that had been building for 8 years. Set into one edge was a recessed pull grip. No keyhole, no lock mechanism of any kind. He gripped the handle with both hands and pulled. The hatch lifted. It rose with a smooth, counterweighted ease that surprised him, precisely engineered, balanced so carefully that 8 years of sitting in the earth had not disturbed its mechanism. It opened as though it had been waiting for exactly this moment, which he realized it had been. The key at his neck was for something else. He did not know what yet. Cold air rose from below. Not unpleasant, not the smell of rot or neglect, but the smell of concrete and dry goods and something mechanical, something deliberately carefully preserved. He could see the top of a metal ladder descending into darkness. He looked at his sister. She was looking into the hatch with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not quite awe, not quite disbelief, but something that contained both of those things and something else underneath them. Something like recognition, as though some part of her, a part that had been holding its breath for 8 years, had just been allowed to exhale. He went down first. The ladder was solid. The rungs were cold and smooth. He descended into the darkness and found the bottom and reached up along the wall, and his hand found a shelf, and on the shelf his fingers closed around a flashlight. He pressed the button. The beam cut through the dark. He had prepared himself for something modest. A storage room. A cache of supplies, tools, maybe some documents. Something proportionate to what a man working alone over several years could build and stock in a remote location. What he saw in the flashlight beam was not modest. The space was roughly 20 feet by 20 feet, with a ceiling high enough to stand in without ducking. The walls were poured concrete, smooth and solid. The floor was concrete as well, swept clean. Along one wall ran floor-to-ceiling metal shelving, organized with a precision that was immediately unmistakably Desmond, labeled in his handwriting, grouped by category, the placement of each item clearly considered. Canned goods, water in sealed containers, medical supplies, tools, each one hung or placed with care, batteries, lanterns, wool blankets still sealed in plastic. Against the opposite wall was a hand-cranked generator wired to a series of light fixtures mounted to the ceiling. In the corner, 2 narrow cots with thin mattresses still covered in their original plastic. In the center of the room, a wooden desk, the kind Desmond would have built himself, plain and sturdy, in exactly what it needed to be. On the desk, a lantern, a cassette recorder, a stack of small cassette tapes, each one labeled with a date and a number in his grandfather's handwriting. And beside the tapes at the center of the desk, a steel document box. Callum's hands were not entirely steady as he crossed the room. He set the flashlight on the desk so the beam pointed toward the ceiling, throwing indirect light across the space. He heard Wren come down the ladder behind him, heard her quiet intake of breath as she took in the room. He put his hands on the document box. He opened it. Inside were 3 things precisely organized in the manner of a man who had thought about this moment for a long time and wanted it to be clear. The first was a document. Several pages stapled the paper, slightly yellowed but intact. He read the header, and the words took a moment to fully register. It was a deed. The deed to 10 acres of land in Rockbridge County, Virginia, 10 acres encompassing the ridge above Grover's Mill, the creek, and its two branches, the resting stone, the twisted pine, and the ground beneath his feet. The deed was not in the name of Desmond Rourke. It had been transferred by legal trust instrument into the name of the Rourke Ridge Trust. And the listed beneficiary of the Rourke Ridge Trust, the individual designated to receive full legal control upon his 18th birthday, was Callum James Rourke. The second item in the box was a card smaller clipped to a sealed envelope. The card read, "For when all else is read." He set that aside. The third item was a letter unsealed, the handwriting on the envelope his grandfather's. He sat down in the wooden chair. Wren sat on the edge of one of the cots, close enough that he could see her face in the reflected light. She had her sketchbook open on her lap, her pencil in her hand, but she wasn't drawing. She was watching him. He opened the letter. "My dear Callum, if you're reading this, then you found the box, and you found the map, and you found your way here. That means everything I hoped about you turned out to be true. That means you are the person I believed you would become. I am more proud of that than I have words for. I need to tell you something that is not easy to tell because I am the kind of man who would rather show a thing than say it, and what I'm about to say cannot be shown. It can only be said. I have known for a long time that your father was in trouble. Not ordinary trouble, the kind of trouble that has weight and teeth, the kind that doesn't let go. He came to me more than once for help, and I gave what I could give. But there is a point beyond which helping becomes enabling, and I had to find that point by trial and error, and by the time I found it, the damage was already very deep. I also know and have known for some years that certain people your father owes money to are not the kind of people who let a debt die with a family. I know what that means for you and your sister. I know what it means for your future if those men ever connect your names to your father's. This is why I built this place. Not as a hiding spot, not as a home, as a foundation. Something they cannot touch, cannot trace, cannot take because it was never in your father's name and it was never in mine. It has been yours legally from the moment I signed the trust. It became fully yours today. The land is real, the deed is real. There is a lawyer in Roanoke, his name and number are in the sealed envelope, who has been holding this trust in escrow for 8 years with instructions to make no disclosures until your 18th birthday. He will hear from you soon, I hope. There is more I need to tell you, more than I can put in a letter. The tapes are for that. I have recorded everything I want you to know about this place, about how it works, about what I built and why and how, about your family's history, which is more complicated than you know, about what I hope for you. But not tonight. Tonight you are safe. Tonight that is enough. I love you, Callum. I loved you from the moment I first held you. You were always the one I believed in. Your grandfather, Desmond. He put the letter down. The room was very quiet. Wren had not moved. The flashlight beam held the desk in its pale circle, and beyond the circle, the concrete walls, and beyond the walls, the Virginia Ridge, and beyond the ridge, a country that had given him a manila envelope and $127 and told him good luck out there. His grandfather had given him 10 acres of land and a foundation and a name on a deed. He sat with that for a long time. He let it move through him, all of it, the grief and the gratitude and the incomprehension and the thing underneath all of those things that was not quite hope, but was in the same family as hope, something warm and directional and alive. Then he stood up, picked up the flashlight, and climbed back up the ladder. He came out of the hatch into cold air and darkness. The stars above the ridge were extraordinary dense and clear in a way that he had never seen from the city, the Milky Way a visible band across the black. He stood in the small clearing and tipped his head back and looked at them. He did not cry. He had thought he might. Instead, he just stood there and breathed and let the cold air fill his lungs and let the stars be as large as they were. After a while, Wren's head appeared at the top of the ladder. She climbed out and came to stand beside him and looked up at the same sky. He knew, she said. Yeah, Callum said. He knew. A long silence stretched between them, warm despite the cold air, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to name it. It's ours, she said finally. He looked at the land around them, the clearing, the trees, the ridge rising above them in the dark, the creek he could hear but not see, the 10 acres his grandfather had spent 15 years assembling, piece by piece, cash transaction by cash transaction, so that no one who was looking for his family's name would find it attached to anything of value. The land was theirs. The foundation was laid. Everything that was going to be built on it was still ahead of them. Come on, he said. Let's go back down. It's cold. She took his arm and they climbed back into the earth, back into the warm light and the organized shelves and the careful, deliberate gift of a man who had loved them from a distance for 8 years and had trusted them to find their way to it. The hatch closed above them. The first morning on the ridge began before sunrise. Callum woke on one of the narrow cots in the underground room and lay still for a moment in the total dark, listening. No televisions, no coughing, no crying child through a partition wall. Just the deep mineral silence of concrete and earth, and beneath that barely audible the sound of the creek somewhere above them, carrying on with its ancient, indifferent business. He dressed in the dark without waking Wren. He climbed the ladder, pushed the hatch open with its effortless counterweighted swing, and came out into the blue pre-dawn cold of the Virginia Ridge. The world up here was a different thing entirely from the world he had left. The trees stood black against a sky that was just beginning to separate itself from night. The darkness thinning at the eastern horizon, going from black to deep blue to something that was almost gray. The air tasted of pine resin and cold water and damp soil, and it moved differently than city air, slower and more purposeful, as though it knew where it was going. He stood in the clearing and breathed it and felt his lungs register the difference. He walked the perimeter of the clearing in the growing light. The ground was mostly level here, protected on 3 sides by the ridge rising steeply above and the forest pressing close on the others. The creek ran 20 yards to the east, audible and consistent. The soil, when he crouched and took a handful of it, was dark and friable, the kind of soil that had been building itself for centuries without anyone interrupting it. Good soil, the kind his grandfather would have recognized immediately. He stood up and looked at the clearing and thought, this is where the cabin goes. Not a plan, not yet, just a recognition, the kind that comes before planning, the moment when a place tells you what it wants to be. He went back down and found the cassette recorder on the desk and a tape labeled with the number 1 and a date from 8 years ago, 3 months before Desmond died. He put the tape in the recorder. He sat in the wooden chair in the yellow light of the lantern he had lit the night before, and he pressed play. A moment of tape hiss, then his grandfather's voice. It was exactly as he remembered it, low and unhurried, each word given its full weight, the particular cadence of a man who had spent his life thinking before he spoke. It hit Callum somewhere in the center of his chest and stayed there, a warm and painful pressure that he had no category for. Callum, if you're listening to this, you found the room. Good. That means the map worked and the key worked and you were paying attention. Those 3 things together will take you a long way. I am going to tell you about this place, what I built, why I built it, how it works. I'll go through everything tape by tape, and I ask you to listen to all of them before you make any major decisions. Some things will make more sense after you've heard the later tapes. Some things I need to say in a particular order. The first thing to know is this: the room is not meant to be lived in permanently. It is a foundation, and a foundation is only useful if something is built on top of it. I built it for you to survive in, not to hide in. There is a difference. I need you to understand that difference from the beginning. Callum listened to the tape through twice. He listened to his grandfather's voice describe the water filtration system connected to the creek, the ventilation shafts disguised as hollow logs on the surface, the generator's maintenance requirements, the organization of the food supplies, and their approximate shelf life. He listened to Desmond describe the legal structure of the trust, the name of the lawyer in Roanoke, who held the documents, the specific language Callum would need to use when he called. When the tape ended, he sat in the silence and felt the weight of the preparation behind it. 8 years of work, of planning, of a man spending his last months and his last dollars building something his grandson would not find until he was old enough to use it. The scope of it was staggering. The love behind it was staggering. He did not have words for either of those things, so he did not try to find them. He just sat with them. Wren came down the ladder at 7, her hair wild from sleep, her sketchbook already under her arm. She looked at him, then at the cassette recorder. "Is it his voice?" she said. "Yeah." She sat on the edge of her cot and hugged her sketchbook to her chest and looked at the recorder with an expression of careful attention. "Can I listen later?" "You can listen to all of them," he said. "He built this for both of us." She nodded, then she opened her sketchbook and began to draw the room, the shelves, the desk, the lantern, the recorder, making it hers the way she made everything hers with a pencil and sustained attention. Callum picked up the phone and dialed the number from the legal documents. The lawyer's name was Wendell Crump, and he answered on the second ring with the alert, measured voice of a man who had been expecting this call for some years and was neither surprised nor flustered to receive it. "You'd be Callum Rourke," he said when Callum identified himself. "Yes, sir." "Your grandfather told me you'd call. He told me it might be a while, that you might need some time to find the map and make your way to the property." A brief pause. "Are you on the property now?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Then let me tell you what we need to do." The call lasted 40 minutes. Wendell Crump walked him through the trust structure with professional patience, the deed, the terms, the fact that the trust had been structured specifically to be immune to claims by creditors of either Desmond's estate or Callum's parents. He used words like irrevocable and insulated and clean title. He told Callum to come to his office in Roanoke as soon as possible with his birth certificate and identification. He told him he would need to establish a legal address. "The property itself can serve as your legal address," Crump said. "There's precedent for that in Virginia, even for undeveloped land, provided you can demonstrate habitation." Callum looked around the underground room. "I'm living here," he said. "We're both living here." A pause. "Both. My sister, she's 15. I need to talk to you about guardianship." Another pause, longer this time, the kind of pause that contains calculation. "That's a more complicated matter," Crump said, "but not impossible. Come to the office. We'll go through it properly." After the call, Callum went back up to the surface and stood in the clearing in the morning light and called Ms. Cornelia Ashford. She answered on the first ring. "Callum." Her voice was somewhere between relieved and furious, the specific register of someone who has been frightened on behalf of another person and needs to express it. "Where are you? Is Wren with you? Are you safe?" "We're safe," he said. "I need your help." A long exhale. "You need my help. Do you understand what you've done? There's a missing persons report. There are—" "I know," he said. "I know all of that. I need your help anyway." He told her about the property, about the trust, about Wendell Crump and Roanoke. He gave her enough, the county, the trust structure, the lawyer's name, and held back everything else. The hatch, the room, the tapes, the ammunition. Kenny had not yet located the one mentioned in the sealed envelope with its final set of instructions, which he had decided to leave where it was until he had time to think clearly about what it meant. Cornelia Ashford was quiet for a long time after he finished. "You're telling me your grandfather set up an irrevocable trust in your name 8 years ago?" "Yes." "With 10 acres of land in Virginia?" "Yes." "And a lawyer who's been sitting on it all this time?" "Yes, ma'am." Another long pause. "Callum," she said finally, and her voice had changed. The fury was gone from it, replaced by something that sounded like exhausted pragmatism, working very hard to become hope. "I am going to need you to not move, not contact anyone else, and let me make some calls. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, "but Miss Ashford Wren stays with me. Whatever happens with the legal process, she stays with me while it's happening. I need you to understand that." A brief silence. "I understand that," she said. "I'll be in touch." The first weeks on the ridge were the hardest and the best of Callum's life, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes one following so quickly after the other that they were difficult to distinguish. The physical work was relentless. He had no construction experience beyond the inherited knowledge that comes from having watched a craftsman. Grandfather at a distance, the logic of level and plumb, the importance of drainage, the way a good foundation changes everything that comes after it. He listened to Desmond's tapes, obsessively rewinding and replaying the sections where his grandfather described the techniques he used, and he found that the voice was not just instructional, but steadying a presence in the work itself, guiding him through each step with the same patience it had guided him through the workshop when he was 10 years old. He cleared the site for the cabin by hand. He borrowed a handsaw and a post-hole digger from Amos Whitfield, who asked no questions and charged a fair price for the rental. He dug the foundation by hand, working in the early mornings before the heat built, learning the soil one shovelful at a time. He learned where the bedrock was and where the drainage ran and where the frost lines sat in the Rockbridge County winter. He learned these things by making mistakes and correcting them the way you learn anything real. Wren planted the garden. She had found seeds in the shelter supplies: beans, squash, tomatoes, lettuce, and several varieties of herb, and she had identified a patch of ground on the south-facing slope just east of the clearing where the light was best. She dug it herself and amended the soil with the composted organic matter Desmond had stored in sealed containers below, and she planted with a methodical care that was entirely her own. Within 2 weeks, she had green shoots. She came to get Callum the morning the first tomato seedling broke soil, pulling him by the arm across the clearing to show him her face lit with a satisfaction he had not seen in her eyes in years. He thought, "We can live here. We can actually live here." He called Wendell Crump again and arranged to travel to Roanoke. The trip took most of a day. Amos Whitfield drove them to the bus stop without being asked, without explaining why leaving before Callum could find adequate words to thank him. In Roanoke, Crump's office was small and tidy and smelled of old books and filtered coffee, and Crump himself was a compact man in his 70s with a careful handshake and the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades managing other people's most important documents. He handed Callum the original deed across the desk, and Callum held it in both hands and felt the weight of the paper and what it represented. And Crump said, "That's yours. Has been for 8 years. It was just waiting for you to be old enough to hold it." The guardianship process began. Crump referred them to a family law attorney. Cornelia Ashford filed documentation on their behalf, advocating within the system for an outcome she had apparently decided she believed in. There were forms and filings and a court date that was set for 6 weeks out. There were phone calls and notarized documents and requirements for proof of habitation and proof of income. Income was the hard part. He found the ammunition can on a Tuesday morning alone, Wren still asleep below. The flat gray stone was exactly where Desmond's sealed letter described, 20 paces from the twisted pine, slightly tilted, not matching the granite surrounding it. It took both hands and a pry bar from the shelter's tool wall to lift it. The can was 2 feet down, sealed in wax-treated canvas, cold and solid, and unmistakably real. He carried it back to the underground room and opened it at the desk. 3 bundles of $100 bills, each one paper-banded, the serial numbers, non-sequential and untraceable. He counted it once slowly in the lamplight, his lips moving with the numbers. Then he wrapped it back up and put it in the bottom drawer of the desk and did not open that drawer again for 6 weeks. Some things you receive before you're ready to hold them. He registered the property. He established habitation. He photographed the site at every stage of development, the cleared ground, the foundation post the framing as it began to rise. And those photographs became the documented evidence of a life being actively built. He opened a bank account at a credit union in Roanoke with $300 from the cash reserves, declaring it as a gift from a family trust, which Crump had confirmed was accurate and documentable. He was doing all of this himself. That was the part he kept returning to in the quiet of the evenings when Wren was asleep, and he sat outside the hatch in the dark and listened to the creek and the nightbirds. He was doing it, not waiting for someone to fix it for him, not hoping that the system would produce a different outcome, if he was patient enough, not relying on anyone who had not already proven they could be relied on. He was doing it one concrete step at a time, with his grandfather's voice in his ear and his sister's trust at his back, and it was working. It was working. And then Harlan Voss came to Grover's Mill. Callum heard about it from Amos Whitfield, who called the burner phone Callum had listed on the trust correspondence. Whitfield's voice was careful and neutral in the manner of a man who has information he is not sure how to deliver. "A man came into the store this morning," he said, "asking about the Rourke property. Said he was family." Callum said nothing. "He was not a friendly sort of man," Whitfield continued. "He had the look of someone who had come a long way to say something he had decided on beforehand and wasn't interested in being argued with. He asked who owned the land up on the ridge now that Desmond was gone." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't handle real estate matters and suggested he check with the county assessor." A pause. "He's driving a silver SUV, Whitfield said. Virginia plates. He's been sitting in the parking lot of the post office for the last 2 hours. I thought you should know." After the call ended, Callum sat for a while in the wooden chair in the underground room. Wren was outside at the garden. He could hear her above him moving around, humming something under her breath. He had known this was possible. He had not known when. Harlan Voss was by blood his father's older half-brother, a connection made complicated by the fact that Callum's father and Harlan shared a father but not a mother, and Harlan had been raised in a different city by his mother's second husband, which was why he carried the surname Voss rather than Rourke. Callum had met him twice, both times briefly, both times in the context of situations involving money. He remembered a big man with heavy shoulders and a loud, expansive manner that was friendly in the fashion of people who are friendly when they want something. He remembered his grandfather watching Harlan with a stillness that was not quite hostility but contained the possibility of it. He had not seen Harlan Voss since he was 9 years old. But Crump had mentioned in one of their calls that under Virginia intestacy law, the law that governs inheritance, when there is no public will, Harlan Voss would have had a legitimate claim to Desmond's estate, including any real property, if the trust had not existed. And the trust had been deliberately structured to be invisible. There was no public will, no probate filing, nothing in any courthouse database that would tell a casual searcher that the Rourke Ridge land had already been disposed of. To anyone looking from the outside, it would appear that 10 acres of prime Virginia ridgeland had been sitting unclaimed for 8 years, attached to the estate of a dead man with no surviving immediate family. He thought about what Amos Whitfield had said. He had the look of someone who had come a long way to say something he had decided on beforehand. A man didn't drive to a small town in the Virginia hills on a sudden impulse. You drove that kind of distance because something had made it worth driving. Something specific. He listened to the next tape that evening. His grandfather's voice, recorded nearly a decade ago, was steady and deliberate as always, but there was something underneath the steadiness on this tape that was different from the earlier ones. A weight, a specific, considered sadness. "There are things about your family's history I should have told you when you were old enough to hear them, and I ran out of time. I am going to tell you now as plainly as I can. Your uncle," he would call himself that, though the connection is looser than he makes it sound, is a man who has never been able to sit still in the presence of something that might be worth money. I have watched him his whole life. I know what he is. I am not saying this to make you hate him. I am saying it so you are not surprised when he appears. And he will appear, Callum. If he has not already, he will. He will hear about the land eventually the way men like him always hear about things. He may come with charm, he may come with threats, he may come with lawyers. Whatever he comes with, understand this, I built the trust specifically to make him powerless. I spent years making certain that the legal ground beneath you is solid enough that nothing he does can move it. But I cannot protect you from what he will try. I can only give you the tools to win. Listen to what he says. Write it down. Every word matters. A pause on the tape, the sound of the old man breathing. I tried to help your father, the voice continued. I tried many times in many ways, and I failed him completely. I will carry that for whatever time I have left. But your father's weakness was his own, and your uncle's hunger is his own, and neither of those things are yours. You did not inherit their failures. You inherited this land and this room and this key and every practical thing I knew how to teach you. Those were always meant for you. I was just waiting until you were old enough to receive them. The tape ended. Callum sat in the silence a long time. The next morning, a county vehicle parked at the base of the access road, and a man walked up through the overgrown ruts and into the clearing where Callum was working on the cabin framing. He was not Harlan Voss. He was a county assessor's official in a windbreaker with an ID badge on a lanyard, holding a clipboard and looking at the developing construction with an expression of professional neutrality. He asked Callum to identify himself. Callum did. He asked the nature of the construction. Callum told him a primary residence on land he owned through the Rourke Ridge Trust established under his name, with Wendell Crump of Roanoke as trustee executor. The official wrote things down. He asked for documentation. Callum brought up the relevant documents on his phone: the trust certification, the deed, the county property registration he had completed 3 weeks prior. The official examined them carefully, noted the relevant numbers on his clipboard, and told Callum he might be hearing from the county shortly regarding a property assessment update. He left without incident. That evening, Cornelia Ashford called. "The Voss family has retained a lawyer," she said without preamble, "a man named Prescott Hale based in Charlottesville. He filed an inquiry with the county assessor's office this afternoon contesting the validity of the Rourke Ridge Trust. The grounds are capacity." Callum was quiet. "Capacity," he said. "They're arguing that Desmond Rourke was suffering from major depressive disorder at the time the trust was executed. There's a clinical record from 2009, a voluntary inpatient stay 6 weeks. They're arguing that a person in that clinical state was not competent to execute a legally binding trust instrument." He thought about the tapes, the clear, methodical voice, the engineering precision of the shelter below him. "When was the trust signed?" he asked. "Crump executed the paperwork and had it filed in early 2010, she said. 6 months after the inpatient stay." 6 months, Callum said. He had been discharged for 6 months by then. "I know, and that's exactly the argument Crump will make. But Hale is a capable attorney, and the Voss family seems motivated. You have 60 days to respond before the court will schedule a preliminary hearing." A pause. "Callum, this is important. Do you understand what they're trying to do? They're trying to invalidate the trust," he said. "If they succeed, the land reverts to Desmond's estate. And under intestacy law, Harlan Voss is the closest surviving heir." "Yes, which means he gets the land." "If they succeed, yes." He was sitting outside the hatch in the dark, the way he often sat in the evenings listening to the creek. The stars above the ridge were brilliant and still. Wren was below listening to one of the tapes. He could hear the faint sound of Desmond's voice rising through the ventilation shaft. "What do I need to do?" he said. Ashford told him. He listened carefully, asking questions when he needed to, not asking them when he didn't. By the end of the call, he had a list. Documentation from Crump proving the gap between the clinical record and the trust execution. Character attestations from anyone who had professional contact with Desmond in 2010. And whatever else Callum could find that demonstrated his grandfather's mental clarity and deliberate intent during that period. He knew what he had. He went back down through the hatch. He went to the cassette player. He put in a tape he had not listened to yet, one from late 2010, 3 months after the trust was signed, and pressed play. Desmond's voice came through the small speaker, clear and unhurried and technically precise, describing the placement of the second ventilation shaft and the load-bearing capacity of the eastern wall. He was describing angles and measurements and material choices, calculating out loud, correcting himself once with mild professionalism rather than confusion. He sounded exactly like what he was, a skilled craftsman, documenting his own work with methodical clarity. Not a man who did not know what he was doing, not a man who could not be trusted to sign his own name to a document. Callum listened to 20 minutes of it. Then he picked up his phone and called Wendell Crump's after-hours number, which Crump had given him for emergencies. "They're using the 2009 records," he said when Crump answered. "I know," Crump said. "I've been expecting this. I've been building the counter-argument since the trust was first executed." A brief pause. "Callum, I need you to listen to me carefully. The tape recordings are potentially very significant. If they are authentic and dated, they constitute a contemporaneous record of your grandfather's mental state during the relevant period. But I need to understand what they say before I can tell you how to use them." "He talks about the construction," Callum said. "Every technical decision, in detail. He sounds like himself." "Good," Crump said. "That's good. Can you bring them to me?" "Not yet," Callum said. "I want to listen to all of them first." A pause, then Crump said with something that might have been approval, "All right, listen to all of them. Then come to Roanoke." Meanwhile, in a house in Charlottesville, 200 miles from the Ridge, Darlene Voss sat at her kitchen table with a laptop and a legal pad and did what she always did when a situation was not resolving itself the way she had planned. She worked the problem from a different angle. Harlan had come home from Grover's Mill with nothing useful. The county assessor's office had been politely unhelpful. The property he had reported seemed to have some kind of trust attached to it. Darlene had listened to this with the focused patience of a woman who has long since learned that her husband identifies problems but rarely identifies solutions. And then she had sat down at the table and opened the Virginia Land Records database. It took her 4 hours to find it. The Rourke Ridge Trust filed in Rockbridge County in early 2010 with a Roanoke attorney named Wendell Crump as trustee executor. Beneficiary listed as Callum James Rourke, effective upon his 18th birthday. She read the filing twice, then a third time, her expression unchanging, her legal pad filling with notes in her compact, angular hand. She had the Charlottesville Bar Directory open before she finished the third reading. Prescott Hale had handled 3 trust challenges in the previous 2 years, winning 2 of them. His firm had a reputation for aggressive discovery practice and a particular expertise in competency challenges. She called his office at 8 the next morning. Callum spent the next 2 weeks listening. Every night after Wren was asleep, he sat at the desk with the recorder and went through the tapes one by one, listening with his full attention, writing notes on a legal pad he had bought at Whitfield's store. He listened for everything, not just the technical content, but the voice itself, the qualities of it, the places where it slowed, and the places where it moved with certainty, the emotional register under the professional manner. What he heard confirmed everything he already believed and gave him things he had not expected. There was a tape from spring of 2010, about 4 months after the trust was executed, in which Desmond spoke about the legal structure at length, not the technical details of the trust, but his reasoning for it. His voice was even and clear, and he laid out his intentions with the same methodical care he brought to every other topic. "I am recording this," he said, "because I want there to be a record of my thinking in this period. I am aware that my medical history from last year could be used by someone unscrupulous to question my competence. I am recording this specifically as a counter to that possibility. I know what I'm doing. I know why I'm doing it. I know who it's for." And then, on a later tape, one dated 18 months after the trust was signed, recorded with the quality of a man who had decided to say something directly and without embroidery. "Your uncle came to see me last month. I need to tell you about it. He said he had heard I was spending money on property improvements. He wanted to know what I was spending it on. When I told him it was none of his business, he got angry in the manner he gets angry loudly, in the fashion of people who have learned that volume is persuasive. He said that when I died, everything I owned was going to come to him, and he had a right to know what it would be worth. I told him that when I died, he would find out what he was entitled to. He took that as agreement. He left satisfied. I want you to understand what he said because you need to understand what kind of man he is. He sat in my kitchen and told me to my face that he was already planning for the disposition of my estate. He said the words, when I die, the way some men say when I retire. As a thing already decided, already accounted for, already spent. He has been gambling for 20 years. He owes money to a number of different institutions and individuals, and he has spent his whole adult life looking for a shortcut to a situation where those debts are someone else's problem. He has looked at this land his entire life as a debt he is owed, not earned owed, for being related to me by an accident of biology. That is why the trust exists. That is why it is structured the way it is. That is why your name is on it and not his. Whatever he tells you, whatever he threatens, whatever legal instrument he tries to use, know that I anticipated it. Know that I built for it. The ground beneath you is solid, Callum. I made certain of it. He stopped the tape. He sat in the underground room in the quiet, with his grandfather's voice still resonating in the close air, and he felt the full architecture of the plan laid out before him. Not just the physical structure of the shelter and the land, but the legal and evidentiary structure Desmond had spent years building around it. The tapes were not incidental. They were not just records of construction. They were evidence carefully made, deliberately preserved for exactly this moment. His grandfather had known Harlan would come. He had known there would be a legal challenge. He had recorded his own competence, his own intent, his own reasoning in a format that would last and that Callum would find in time to use it. He thought about the word Desmond had used on the very first tape foundation. This was part of the foundation too. He spent 2 days making handwritten copies of the most relevant portions of the tapes, the dates, the content, the specific passages he intended to use. He organized them chronologically. He wrote a summary for Crump in plain, clear language, noting the tape number and date for each significant passage. He went to Roanoke and sat in Crump's office for 4 hours going through all of it. Crump listened without interrupting, making notes in a small, precise hand. When Callum finished, Crump set down his pen and looked at the material spread across his desk. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man." "Yes," Callum said. "He anticipated every significant angle of this challenge. The clinical record is addressed by the gap in dates. The argument of ongoing incapacity is addressed by the tapes which demonstrate consistent, sophisticated reasoning throughout 2010 and beyond. The issue of intent is addressed by the tape in which he explicitly discusses the trust and his reasoning for it." Crump paused. "And the tape describing the conversation with Harlan Voss is potentially significant in a different way, because it establishes that Harlan knew about the land before Desmond died, and establishes Harlan's stated expectation of inheriting it." Crump nodded. "Yes, that context matters." He filed the response to Hale's motion 2 days before the deadline. The response was 40 pages supported by certified copies of the relevant tapes, expert attestations from 2 clinical professionals Crump retained regarding the timeline of depressive episodes and recovery, and a sworn affidavit from Crump himself regarding Desmond's state of mind at the time the trust was executed. The preliminary hearing was scheduled. In the weeks between the filing and the hearing, Callum worked. He cleared the site thoroughly, learning the soil's composition and drainage patterns before placing a single post. He worked through overcast days and clear days, and on the 2 days it rained hard enough to slow the work significantly, he stayed in the underground room listening to tapes and reading through the legal filings and going over the argument he was building in his mind. By the end of the 3rd week, the cabin walls were taking shape. The foundation posts were set in concrete, plumb and level checked 3 times each. The framing rose slowly but solidly, each joint fitted with the care his grandfather had tried to teach him. Measure twice, cut once, and when in doubt, measure again. Wren was a constant presence through all of it. She kept the garden she cooked on the camp stove she drew in her sketchbook with the focused intensity she brought to everything. The cabin at different stages of construction, the garden in different lights, the ridge in fog and sun, and the particular blue clarity of high autumn. She had begun drawing Callum himself, working from memory, when he was outside capturing him from behind, in the act of working, driving a post, lifting a timber, reading by lamplight. He found the sketches one evening and looked through them and saw himself as she saw him. And the person in the drawings was not the scared kid who had run from a shelter with a canvas bag and $127. The person in the drawings was someone who knew what he was doing. He was not sure that was accurate, but he was beginning to believe it might become accurate, which was not the same thing but was not entirely different either. The sketchbook had grown fat with drawings by this point, weeks of accumulated pages, the whole arc of their journey from the shelter to the ridge, documented in pencil and charcoal, with a precision and feeling that caught him off guard every time he looked through it. She had drawn the hatch, the underground room, the shelves of supplies. She had drawn Amos Whitfield on his porch. She had drawn the courtroom from memory after their first visit to Crump's office, capturing the quality of formal spaces with the particular accuracy of someone who had been paying close attention to everything. She had drawn the view from the clearing at different hours, the ridge changing character with the light. He realized, looking through the sketchbook on the evening of the third week, that she had documented everything. Not just the landscape, not just the construction, everything. Every stage, every person, every significant moment rendered with the full attention of an artist who understood that what she was seeing was worth recording. He called Crump the next morning. "The sketchbook," he said, "Wren's drawings, could they be used?" A pause. "Tell me what's in them." He described the contents, the chronology, the documentation of habitation and construction, the people they had encountered. "Bring it to the hearing," Crump said, "as a supplement to the photographic evidence. The judge is going to want the fullest possible picture of what's actually been built on that land and how long you've been there. A contemporaneous visual record made by someone who was present." A pause. "Yes, bring it," he told Wren that evening. She looked at him for a moment, then down at the sketchbook in her lap. "All of it," she said. "Everything from the shelter forward." She thought about it. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said. "If it helps." "It helps," he said. The night before the preliminary hearing, he sat outside in the dark and listened to the ridge and thought about what was coming. He had been over the argument until he knew it cold. He had the tapes. He had Crump. He had 40 pages of documented counter-evidence. He went back inside. He put on his cleanest flannel shirt and set it ready on the chair. He lay down on his cot and looked at the ceiling of the underground room and listened to the deep, purposeful silence of it. And for the first time since they had arrived on the ridge, he felt something that was genuinely close to peace. Not the peace of a problem solved, the peace of a man who has prepared as well as he knows how and is ready for whatever comes next. He found out what came next the following morning. The courtroom in the Rockbridge County Courthouse was small and plain, with wood paneling that had gone dark with age and fluorescent lights that turned everyone the same institutional color. Crump sat beside Callum at the respondent's table. Ashford was in the gallery 2 rows back, with a folder on her lap and her reading glasses on. Harlan Voss came in with Prescott Hale at 5 minutes before the hour. He was bigger than Callum remembered, heavier in the shoulders, thicker through the middle, moving with the careful deliberateness of a large man who has learned to manage the space he takes up in formal settings. He was wearing a dark suit that fit well, and his hair was silver at the temples. He had the face of a man who had been handsome once and had spent the intervening years believing he still was. He came in and sat down without looking at Callum. Then he looked. It was a brief look, calibrating, assessing the look of a man trying to determine what he is dealing with. Callum held it without expression. He was 18 years old, sitting in a Rockbridge County courtroom in the same flannel shirt he wore every other day, with his grandfather's documented voice on a cassette recorder on the table in front of him. Beside Harlan, Darlene Voss sat very still. She was a composed woman, thin and sharp-featured, and she was watching the courtroom with the attentive calculation of someone who was looking for angles even now, even here. She did not look at Callum. She looked at the recorder on the table, and then briefly she looked at Crump. And something moved through her face, small control gone almost before it appeared. The recognition of someone who has just understood that the terrain is not what they thought it was. Prescott Hale's presentation was polished and aggressive. He had clearly done this kind of work before. The language was precise, the documents were organized. The argument was constructed with the smooth confidence of a man who expected it to succeed. He laid out the clinical record, The date's the argument of ongoing incapacity. He was persuasive. He was thorough. Then Crump stood up. He asked the court's permission to play a portion of an audio recording. The judge, a compact woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the expression of someone who has heard every argument twice, looked at the recorder, then at Hale, then at Crump. "Counsel," she said to Hale. Hale objected. Crump responded. They argued procedure for 12 minutes. The judge listened with her glasses folded in her hand, and when both lawyers had finished, she said, "I'll allow a sample, 2 minutes." Crump pressed play. Desmond's voice filled the small courtroom. He was describing the Eastern Wall's load-bearing calculations. He was specific about materials and measurements and the reasoning behind each choice. He was unmistakably a man in full possession of himself, performing complex reasoning, making considered decisions, explaining his thinking with the clarity of someone who expected his work to last. The judge listened with her head slightly tilted. In the gallery, Ashford had gone very still. At the petitioner's table, Prescott Hale was writing something on a legal pad with slightly more force than necessary. Harlan Voss was not writing anything. He was looking at the recorder on the table. His expression had changed. The polished composure had developed a fracture in it, small and visible. The face of a man confronting something he had not anticipated and was working through the implications of in real time. Darlene Voss beside him had closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them again, her face was composed, but her left hand, flat on the table, had tightened into something that was almost a fist. The judge raised her hand. Crump stopped the tape. She looked at both tables for a long moment. "I'm going to need time to review the submitted documentation," she said. "This hearing is continued for 30 days. I want complete transcripts of all recordings submitted as evidence, along with the clinical expert testimony, before I make any ruling on the preliminary motion." She looked at Hale. "Counsel, I would suggest your client take the intervening period to thoroughly review the respondent's evidentiary package." She gathered her papers and stood, and the bailiff called the room to order. Callum stood. Harlan Voss stood on the other side of the room. For a moment, they looked at each other across the width of the courtroom floor, across the distance of 9 years, and a dead man's plan, and 10 acres of Virginia ridgeland, and everything that had happened in between. Harlan Voss was a big man with silver hair and a dark suit and a lifetime's belief that the world owed him something. Callum was 18 years old with calloused hands and a grandfather's voice on a cassette tape. He held the look until Harlan looked away. Then he picked up the recorder, put it in his bag, and walked out of the courtroom into the afternoon light. The 30 days between the continued hearing and the judge's ruling were the most productive of Callum's life. He did not wait. Waiting was what the other side wanted. Waiting meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was a tool Prescott Hale was practiced at using. Every week that passed without resolution was a week Harlan Voss could use to find new angles, file new motions, wear down the respondent's resources, and resolve. Callum had watched enough of the legal process by now to understand its essential nature. It was a test of endurance as much as a test of merit, and the side that moved forward while the other side waited almost always finished stronger. So he built. The roof took 10 days of demanding work. Standing seam metal, the most durable option for the Blue Ridge climate, unforgiving to install, requiring precision at every seam and fastener, the kind of work where a small miscalculation compounds itself across the entire surface. He made one such miscalculation on the third day, discovering a flaw in his pitch calculation that would have pooled water at the north eave. He tore out the affected section and started over. He did not permit himself frustration about it. He had used the wrong number. He used the correct one now. Desmond's voice on the tapes had said, "Measure twice, cut once." He was coming to understand that this was not a suggestion. The cabin was 30 feet by 20 feet, with a sleeping loft accessed by a fixed ladder, 2 windows on the south face to catch the light, a wood stove in the center, and a covered porch along the east side that looked out over the valley and the ridge beyond. It was not beautiful in the way that design things are beautiful. It was beautiful in the way that functional things are beautiful. The beauty of a good tool, of a joint fitted correctly, of a structure that will stand in wind and ice, because every element of it was placed with understanding rather than hope. The first morning, he lit the wood stove inside the finished cabin and sat at the small table he had built and drank coffee and looked out the south window at the ridge. He felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for as long as he could remember. Not peace exactly. Peace felt passive, and this was something more active than that. More like alignment, the feeling of a life and the shape of a life beginning for the first time to match each other. Wren moved her cot up from the underground room and arranged the loft with the particular creative precision she brought to every space she inhabited. Her sketchbook stacked in order along one wall, her pencils and charcoal organized in a row of tin cans, a small lamp positioned so the light fell correctly on her work. She drew the cabin from the outside from multiple angles in different lights. She drew the garden, which was producing now beans coming in heavy on the pole supports Callum had built tomatoes, ripening on the south-facing plants, squash sprawling in orange and green abundance across the lower beds. She was growing here. He could see it plainly. The pallor from 2 years of institutional living was gone from her face. She moved through the days with an energy and purpose that was entirely her own, needing less from him and giving more the particular confidence that comes from having made something real with your own hands in a place you have chosen. He was proud of her in a way that exceeded what the word usually means. The call from Prescott Hale came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days before the continued hearing. Callum was on the porch when his phone rang, the unfamiliar number resolving into a Charlottesville area code. He answered, "Mr. Rourke." The voice was professional and neutral, the carefully calibrated neutrality of a lawyer in an uncomfortable position. "This is Prescott Hale. I represent the Voss family in the pending trust dispute. I'd like to speak with you directly if you're willing." Callum said nothing. He waited. "I want to be candid with you," Hale said, and the word candid in Callum's experience almost always meant the opposite of itself in a legal context. "I have been engaged in a review of certain financial documents related to my clients, and I have become aware of information that significantly affects the legal landscape of this matter." Still nothing from Callum. "Mr. Rourke, I'm going to tell you something that my client does not know I'm telling you, and I need you to understand why I'm doing it before I say it." "Say it," Callum said. A brief pause. Harlan Voss entered into a timber purchase agreement with a company called Consolidated Timber Group 14 months ago. The agreement was conditional on probate clearance establishing him as the legal heir to the Rourke Ridge property. In exchange for executing that agreement, he received an advance payment of $180,000. Callum was quiet for a moment. "He spent it," Hale said. "All of it. The full advance is gone. Gambling debts primarily in several outstanding personal loan obligations." Another pause. "If the Rourke Ridge Trust is upheld, which based on what I have now reviewed in your response package, I believe it likely will be Consolidated Timber will pursue Harlan Voss for the return of that advance plus contractual penalties. We are speaking about a sum in the neighborhood of $240,000 minimum against a man who has no liquid assets." Callum looked out at the valley. The afternoon light was long and golden across the ridge, the kind of light that made the forested hillsides look as though they were lit from inside. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. Another pause. Longer this time. "Because I have an obligation to the court that supersedes my obligation to a client who withheld material information from me when I agreed to represent him," Hale said. The professional neutrality had thinned, and underneath it was something that sounded like genuine irritation. "And because I would rather deliver this information directly to you than have it emerge in the hearing in a way that creates complications for everyone, I intend to withdraw from this representation before the hearing date. What I have told you is information you are free to use." A long silence. "I need it documented," Callum said. "I need you to put this in a statement I can use." A very long pause. "I'll provide a sworn statement to the court," Hale said finally, "confirming the existence of the Consolidated Timber Agreement and the advance payment. I will not testify to anything beyond those documented facts. That's enough, Callum said. Callum. After the call ended, he sat on the porch for a long time. The light shifted across the ridge. A hawk moved in slow circles above the tree line, patient and efficient, riding the thermals without apparent effort. He thought about his grandfather's voice on the tape, the careful, unhurried planning of it, the way Desmond had described Harlan's visit, the man sitting in his kitchen already calculating the value of what he expected to inherit, already treating a living man's land as a future asset. I anticipated it. Know that I built for it. He had built for this too. Not specifically, he could not have known about consolidated timber, about the advance, about the particular form. Harlan's desperation would take a decade after Desmond's death. But he had understood the nature of the man. He had understood that Harlan would overextend. That greed of that particular kind always overextends. That a man who treats other people's things as already his own will always eventually spend money he doesn't have on assets he doesn't own. Desmond had not needed to know the specifics. He had known the shape of it. Callum went inside and called Crump. He told Wren that evening, sitting at the table while she drew by lamplight. He gave her the relevant facts plainly and without editorializing. Here is what is true. Here is what it means. Here is what comes next. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her pencil resting on the page. So he spent money from selling land he didn't own, she said. Yes. And now he can't pay it back. No. She looked down at her sketchbook. Then she turned to a fresh page and began to draw, and he did not ask what she was drawing. He let her work. The morning of the continued hearing, Callum woke before dawn, built a fire in the wood stove, and made coffee. He sat at the table in the firelight and went through his notes one final time. Not because he needed to review them, he knew the argument cold, but because the act of reviewing them was itself a form of preparation, a way of being deliberate about what was coming. He had the cassette recorder. He had the transcripts Crump had prepared. He had the photographic record of the property and the construction. He had Wren's sketchbook, which she had given him without hesitation. He had Hale's sworn statement delivered to the court clerk 2 days prior, after Hale had formally withdrawn from representation. And he had something else, something he had found on his third-to-last tape, which he had listened to 2 nights before. The tape was from late 2011, a year after the trust was executed, and it was different in character from the others. The earlier tapes had the quality of documentation, thorough, technical, organized. This one had the quality of a man at the end of a long project setting down the final thoughts that hadn't fit anywhere else. Desmond had talked about the cabin he imagined. Not the underground room, the real cabin, the one he hoped Callum would build above ground, the one he had not been able to build himself because a visible structure would have made the property visible, and visible property invited exactly the kind of attention he was trying to avoid. He had described it with the specificity of someone who had spent years designing it in his mind. The placement of the windows for the mountain light, the covered porch for the summer evenings and the early mornings, the wood stove that would be the center of the room's warmth and its logic. He had described it in enough detail that Callum, listening, had recognized the cabin he had built. Not perfectly, not in every element, but in its essential character, the orientation, the proportions, the porch facing the valley. He had built it the way Desmond had imagined it without knowing that was what he was doing. That convergence, his choices, and his grandfather's vision arriving at the same place through entirely separate routes had moved him in a way he was not prepared for. He had sat in the cabin in the dark after the tape ended and understood for the first time what it truly meant for one generation to carry the work of another forward. Not as obligation, as inheritance. The tape had ended with Desmond's voice quiet and deliberate. I have done everything I know how to do, Callum. The rest is yours. Whatever you build up there, and I believe it will be something worth building, build it to last. Build it the way I tried to teach you. Not fast, not to impress anyone. To last. That's the only thing that matters in the end. The things that are still standing after everything else falls down. He put the notes away and finished his coffee and went out to the porch. The valley was just beginning to show the first gray light of pre-dawn. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the smell of the season. Turning leaves beginning their slow release. The soil cooling, the quality of the light changing in that way, particular to early autumn in the Virginia highlands, going from summer's high brightness to something lower and more amber and more beautiful for being temporary. He stood there for a while. Then he went back inside, put on his cleanest flannel shirt, and drove to the courthouse. The Rockbridge County courtroom was the same as it had been 30 days before, same wood paneling, same fluorescent light, same institutional quality of a space designed for serious things. But the atmosphere was different. The first hearing had been exploratory, both sides feeling out the terrain. This one had the quality of a conclusion. Prescott Hale was not present. A different lawyer sat at the petitioner's table, someone from Hale's firm, clearly brought in at short notice with the slightly frantic organization of a person working from someone else's materials. Harlan Voss sat beside him in the same dark suit, and the change in him since the first hearing was visible. The polished composure was gone. What was left was a large man who had not been sleeping well, whose face had the gray collapsed quality of someone whose expectations have been methodically dismantled. Beside him, Darlene Voss sat with her hands folded on the table. She was dressed carefully and her face was composed, but there was a tightness around her eyes and a precision to her stillness that was not calm, it was control. She had spent the last 30 days working every angle she could find, and she knew sitting here now that none of them had worked. She did not look at Callum. She looked straight ahead, and her face gave nothing away, and the quality of her composure was the composure of someone who is already thinking about what comes after this. The judge entered, sat, reviewed her papers. She looked at the petitioner's table. "I note that Mr. Hale has withdrawn from this representation," she said. "I have received his submission to the court regarding the Consolidated Timber Group Agreement. That submission has been reviewed and entered into the record." She paused. "Counsel, is your client prepared to proceed today?" The replacement lawyer stood. He was prepared to proceed. His argument was significantly shorter than Hale's had been the withdrawal of the competency argument in light of the audio evidence, a fallback position regarding the trust procedural validity that Crump had already addressed in his filing a final motion that the judge had already indicated she was unlikely to grant. Crump's response was 20 minutes. He was thorough and calm and precise, and Callum sat beside him and listened and thought about the long continuity of careful men doing careful work, generation by generation, building things that lasted. When Crump finished, he submitted Wren's sketchbook as a supplementary exhibit. The judge looked at it with her reading glasses on, turning pages, slowly spending more time on it than Callum had expected. The room was very quiet. He could hear the fluorescent lights humming. She set the sketchbook down. She looked at Callum. "Young man," she said, and her voice was entirely neutral but not unkind. "How old are you?" 18, Your Honor. "And you built the structure on this property yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor." "While this proceeding was ongoing?" "Yes, Your Honor." She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked back at her papers. "The petitioner's motion to invalidate the Rourke Ridge Trust is denied," she said. "The clinical record presented does not establish ongoing incapacity at the time of execution, and the audio evidence submitted by the respondent constitutes contemporaneous documentation of the grantor's mental clarity and deliberate intent that the petitioner's evidence cannot overcome." She paused. "The Rourke Ridge Trust is valid as executed. Callum James Rourke is the legal beneficiary with full property rights as specified in the trust instrument." Another pause. "I am also noting for the record that this court takes a dim view of legal challenges constructed around selectively applied evidence, and I will be referring the circumstances of the petitioner's Consolidated Timber Agreement to the county attorney's office for review." She gathered her papers. Harlan Voss made a sound, not words, just a sound low and involuntary. The sound of a man who has been carrying a belief about how a situation would resolve and has just had it taken from him entirely. The judge stood. The bailiff called the room to order. Callum stood. He did not look at Harlan immediately. He picked up the sketchbook and put it carefully in his bag and shook Crump's hand. Then at the door, something in him simply stopped moving forward, and he turned back. Harlan Voss was still at the petitioner's table, not moving, his replacement lawyer gathering papers beside him with professional efficiency. Darlene Voss was standing now, her bag over her arm. She was looking at her phone. Whatever number she was reading on the screen, it was not a good one. Something moved through her face, quick and controlled, and she put the phone back in her bag without answering it and walked out ahead of her husband, alone and separate, already somewhere else in her mind. The calculation had come back wrong, and she was already recalculating. Harlan didn't move for a long moment. He just sat there with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the middle distance, and for the first time, Callum could see in his face not the entitled calculation of the man who had come to Grover's Mill, expecting to claim something, but something more basic and more defeated. The face of a man who had spent 20 years building his future on someone else's foundation and had just discovered that the foundation was not there. Callum looked at him for a moment. He did not feel triumph. He had expected some hot, satisfying surge of vindication, the specific pleasure of watching a thing you had worked hard for confirmed. What he felt instead was something quieter and more complicated, something that acknowledged without forgiveness that the man across the room had been shaped by forces partly beyond his control, and that whatever Harlan Voss was, the waste of him was genuinely sad, even if the waste was his own doing. He turned and walked out. The afternoon was warm and clear, the kind of October day in the Virginia highlands that seems to exist as an argument for the necessity of seasons. The sky so blue it was almost architectural. The trees on the ridge beyond the courthouse parking lot showing the full range of their color, gold and orange and deep red against the blue. Cornelia Ashford was waiting outside, her folder still under her arm, her reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked at him for a moment. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She made a sound that was something between a laugh and an exhale and put her hand briefly on his shoulder. A gesture she made quickly and retracted just as quickly, her professional reflexes reasserting themselves. But it was there. It counted. "The guardianship hearing is next week," she said, returning to business with the efficiency of a woman who has kept herself sane for 30 years by staying focused on what comes next. "I know," Callum said. "You have everything you need for it." "I know," he said again. She looked at him for another moment with the specific expression of someone who has watched a process from the beginning and is measuring what they see at the end of it against what they saw at the start. "Your grandfather would have—" she began and then stopped herself. She shook her head slightly. "Go home, Callum." He went home. The cabin was warm when he got back, the wood stove still holding heat from the morning fire. Wren was at the table with her sketchbook drawing by the light from the south window. She looked up when he came in, and the question was in her face before she asked it. "Done," he said. She set down her pencil. She crossed the room and put her arms around him, which was not something she did often. She was not in general a physically demonstrative person. He put his arms around her and held on, feeling the reality of her small and solid and alive, and they stood like that for a moment in the warm cabin on the Virginia ridge. "We made it," she said. Her voice was muffled against his shoulder, and he felt her exhale the long, slow release of months of held breath. "We made it," he said. She stepped back and looked at him with her wide, dark eyes. "I want to call it something," she said. "The property, it should have a name." He thought about it. "It already has a name. Rourke Ridge." She considered this, turning it over. Then she nodded slowly, satisfied. "Rourke Ridge," she said. "Okay." He went outside to split wood the way he did most evenings when the light was still good. The rhythm of it, familiar now, the weight and swing of the axe calibrated by weeks of practice, each piece of wood reading differently under the blade and requiring its own small adjustment. He had come to understand what his grandfather had tried to show him in the workshop all those years ago. The thing about grain and direction, about finding the way a material wanted to go and working with it rather than against it. The lesson applied to wood. It applied to soil and weather and legal proceedings and the slow building of a life. It applied to everything that was worth doing. He worked until the light went splitting a full winter's worth of wood that he stacked under the porch overhang in the ordered rows Desmond had described on one of the tapes. He worked with the focused ease of someone doing something they know how to do, and he did not think about the courtroom or Harlan Voss or the Consolidated Timber Group. He thought about the wood and the axe and the particular satisfaction of a clean split. That night after Wren was asleep in the loft, he went back down through the hatch one more time. He had been down here many times since the first night, but it was different now. The urgency was gone, the quality of desperate sanctuary. It was just a room, an extraordinary room built by an extraordinary man, but a room. Its purpose was served. It had carried them through the way Desmond had intended, and now the thing built on top of it was real and solid and his. He sat in the wooden chair and looked around at the shelves and the supplies and the desk and the lantern and the cassette recorder, and he felt the full weight of what it had taken to make this place. The years of work, the money spent so carefully, the deliberate invisibility of it, the profound and precise love that had shaped every decision. A man spending the end of his life building something his grandson would not find until he was old enough to use it, and believing absolutely that his grandson would find it and would be equal to it. He had believed that without knowing it would be true. He had believed it because the alternative building and not believing was not something Desmond Rourke would have been capable of. He had been a man who made things to last, and belief was part of what made them last. Callum looked at the last two tapes. He had saved them deliberately knowing they were the final ones not ready until now to hear them. He put the first in the recorder and pressed play. Desmond's voice, older sounding than the earlier tapes, a little rougher, the voice of a man who is not well and knows it. "I think this might be one of the last of these," he said. "My hands aren't what they were. Writing is easier than talking some days and harder on others. I want to say a few things I haven't said yet. The first is about your father. I want you to understand something about him. He was not a bad man. He was a weak man, and weakness is not the same thing as badness, though the damage they do can look similar from the outside. He loved you. I know he did because I watched him with you when you were small, and the way he looked at you was the same way I used to look at him before things went wrong. He just could not hold it together, and the reasons he couldn't are complicated and old, older than either of you. I am not asking you to forgive him. I am asking you to understand that you are not him. You are not his limitations. You are not his choices. You prove that by finding your way to this room. A pause, the sound of breathing. The second thing is about the land. I want you to know why I cared about it so much, because it might seem from the outside like a strange thing to spend your last years and your last money on. Land in the mountains far from everything worth more in timber than in any other way. I cared about it because it was the last thing I owned that was truly mine, that no one else had a claim on, that could not be attached or argued over or sold out from under me. In my life, I have watched a great deal be taken from the people I love by forces that move faster than they could defend against. I wanted to give you something that could not be taken, not money which can be spent and stolen and lost, land which stays. And I wanted you to build something on it, not just to have it, but to build on it with your hands the way I tried to teach you. Because there is a thing that happens to a man when he builds something, a thing that cannot happen any other way. He becomes responsible for it. He becomes, in a real sense, its author. And when you are the author of the place you live in it differently than if you were just a tenant in someone else's idea. You live in it like it's yours, because it is. Build something worth living in, Callum. That's all I ask. The tape ended. He sat for a moment. Then he put in the last tape. It was very short, less than 2 minutes. Recorded in a single continuous take without pauses or corrections, the way you say something you have already said many times in your head and just need finally to say out loud. I have thought a great deal about what I want to leave you, and in the end, I keep coming back to the same thing. Not the land, not the money, not the legal structure. All of those things matter, but none of them is the most important thing. The most important thing is this: I believe in you. I believed in you when you were 10 years old, And I believe in you now, across whatever distance and time separate the moment I am recording this from the moment you are hearing it. I have watched a great deal of the world, and I have known a great many people in genuine character, the kind that holds under pressure, the kind that chooses the hard right thing when the easy wrong thing is available, is rarer than gold and worth more than any piece of land. You have it. I saw it in you when you were small, and I trusted it enough to build all of this on it. I was not wrong. I am never wrong about the things I care enough to be careful about. There is one more thing in this room I haven't told you about. On the east wall below the second shelf, there is a seam in the concrete. Look closely, you'll see it. You may have noticed that the hatch opens without a key. I engineered it that way deliberately. A lock on the hatch could be picked, or the mechanism could corrode over 8 years of disuse. What the key opens is something no one would think to look for unless they already knew it was there. Whatever is inside is for you. It is the last thing I had to give. Use it the way I tried to use everything, carefully, slowly, to build rather than to show. I love you, son. I always will. That doesn't stop when I do. The tape ran out. The recorder clicked off. Callum sat in the silence of the underground room for a long time. He sat with the words and let them settle into him, into the places that had been empty for 8 years. And he felt the weight of them not as a burden, but as the opposite of a burden ballast. The weight that keeps a vessel upright in rough water. Then he stood up. He crossed the room to the east wall. He looked at the second shelf. Below it, at the level of his knees, he ran his fingers along the concrete surface. And after a moment, he felt it, a seam thin as a pencil line, forming a rectangle about 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, perfectly flush with the wall surface invisible, unless you were looking for it and knew what you were looking for. He took the iron key from the cord at his neck. He had wondered, standing at the hatch on that first night, why the key existed at all if the hatch needed no lock. He had set the question aside, filing it for later the way his grandfather had filed things, not dismissing them, holding them until the right moment. The right moment was now. The keyhole was there, a small recess set into the right side of the rectangle, covered with a thin plate that swung aside when he pressed it. He put the key in. It turned with the same clean, deep sound it had made in his imagination, the sound of precise engineering doing what it was designed to do. The panel came free, swinging inward on a concealed hinge. Inside was a cavity in the concrete, roughly the same dimensions as the panel, lined with wax-treated canvas. Inside the canvas, a steel box sealed with a small padlock that the key also opened. Inside the steel box, a letter. And under the letter, something wrapped in oilcloth. He opened the letter. The handwriting was shaky, shakier than any of the other letters, the handwriting of a man whose hands were failing, but whose mind was not. Callum, you have found everything now. You have found the land, the room, the tapes, and this. I want to tell you about this one specifically because it is different from the rest. The rest I built for you. This I built against something. When your father's debts became impossible to manage, certain men began looking for ways to recover what they were owed. These were not legitimate creditors. They were the kind of men who operate outside the systems that protect people like you and your sister. I was afraid of what they might do. I was afraid they might at some future point arrive at your door and tell you that your father's obligations were now yours. They are not. But fear does not listen to reason. I contacted these men. I did not give them my name or your father's name. I made inquiries through channels that could not be traced back to any of us. I found out the full amount of your father's outstanding obligations to them, every dollar, every interest charge, every penalty. And then I paid it. I paid it in cash through intermediaries with money I raised by selling the last piece of property I owned outright, a parcel of land my own father left me that I had never developed and never intended to sell. I had been holding it as a last reserve. This is what I used it for. They will not come for you. That door is closed. It has been closed for several years, and the men involved have moved on to other concerns and would have no reason to connect your name to a debt that was settled long ago by a transaction with no names attached to it. I am telling you this because you deserve to know. You deserve to know that the path ahead of you is clear, not because the world is fair, but because I spent everything I had left making certain that the specific unfairness that threatened you was addressed before I went. The oilcloth contains the documentation of the transaction. Keep it. You will likely never need it, but keep it. I have nothing left to give you now except what I have already given, and what I have already given is everything. The land, the foundation, the knowledge of how to use your hands, and the absolute certainty which I carry with me in whatever comes next, that you are equal to whatever the world puts in front of you. Your grandfather, Desmond Elijah Rourke. P.S. Build the porch facing east. The morning light on that ridge is something worth waking up for. He held the letter for a long time. His hands were very still. He had built the porch facing east. He had not known why he chose that direction. It had felt right the way things feel right when they come from somewhere deeper than deliberate decision. He had stood in the clearing on the second morning and looked at the light moving across the valley and known without reasoning through it that the porch should face that way. His grandfather had known that too. From the underground room, from the tapes, from the maps and the legal documents, in the years of preparation, he had known how his grandson would build. He sat with that for a long time. The convergence of it, the man who laid the foundation and the man who built on it, arriving at the same vision through separate paths, separated by 8 years and death. And everything that had happened in between was more than he had words for. He did not try to find words for it. He just held it. He wrapped the letter carefully and put it back with the documentation. He closed the panel. He looked around the room one last time, taking in the shelves and the supplies and the desk and the chair and the recorder with its last empty tape. He picked up the cassette recorder and carried it up through the hatch. The morning was beginning. The sky to the east was going from dark blue to the pale clear gold of early light, the ridge above the valley catching the first sun and holding it a moment before it spread down through the trees. He stood on the porch, the east-facing porch, and watched the light come, and it was exactly what Desmond had said it was. Something worth waking up for. The guardianship hearing was the following week, and it went the way Cornelia Ashford had predicted, straightforwardly without opposition, the judge reviewing the documentation and the property record and the evidence of a stable and functioning home and signing the order. Callum drove back from Lexington with the papers on the seat beside him, and when he got home and told Wren, she cried, which surprised him, and then he cried too, which did not surprise him at all. That was a Tuesday. On Thursday, Amos Whitfield drove up the access road in his truck with 2 neighbors Callum had come to know over the preceding weeks, a retired school teacher named Bert Halverson and a farmer named Chester Pruitt, and the 3 of them helped Callum finish the section of the porch railing that had been giving him trouble. They worked through the afternoon and talked about practical things, and when the railing was done and solid, they all stood back and looked at the cabin, and Whitfield said in his particular manner, that was not effusive, but was not nothing either. That'll stand. It would stand. Callum knew it would. He had built it to. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of Rourke Ridge established itself with the natural ease of a thing that is in its right place. Mornings fire coffee work. The autumn was coming on fast now, the trees releasing their colors, and then their leaves, the ridge going from fire-colored to bare, the cold coming in hard, some nights the wood stove earning its keep. He learned the work of the season, the insulation that needed checking the water system winterizing Desmond had described in specific detail on tape 11, the preparations for the months of ice and wind that the Blue Ridge delivers without sentiment. He learned to read the weather from the sky the way Desmond had described, learning to read it the specific cloud formations that meant snow was coming, the quality of the air when the temperature was about to drop hard, the way the creek changed its sound before rain. He learned these things not from books, but from paying attention the same way you learn anything that matters and intends to stay with you. Wren received a letter from a small arts organization in Roanoke, forwarded through Ashford, inquiring whether she would be willing to contribute drawings to a community gallery exhibition in the spring. She had entered a competition the previous month without telling Callum, submitting 3 pieces from her sketchbook. She had won second place. She showed him the letter at dinner, sliding it across the table with elaborate casualness that did not fool him for a single moment. He read it. Then he looked at her. Second place, he said. There were a lot of entries, she said. Second place, he said again. She picked up her fork and looked at her plate, and the smile she was trying to suppress was the most alive thing he had seen in months. He framed the letter and hung it on the wall of the cabin beside the south window, next to the photograph of their grandparents he had kept in his pocket since the night at the shelter. He did not ask her if she minded. She saw it there the next morning and did not say anything, but he caught her looking at it twice during the day, and the second time, she didn't look away quickly. The letter from Cornelia Ashford came in late November. A personal letter, not official correspondence, written on plain paper in her rounded, deliberate hand. She was retiring in December, she wrote. 32 years in family services was enough. She was going to visit her daughter in Tennessee and meet her new grandson and sit on a porch for a while and not be responsible for anyone she hadn't chosen to be responsible for. She sent a photograph herself holding a baby squinting happily into sunlight. She asked how the garden had done this year. She asked if the cabin was warm enough for the winter. She asked if Wren was drawing. He wrote back on the same day. The garden had done well, better than expected for a first season, better than either of them had dared hope when they put the first seeds in the ground. The cabin was warm. Wren was drawing everything. He did not know, writing it, how to convey what had been built here. Not just the structure, not just the legal victory, not just the two of them surviving when the system had done its efficient best to make sure they wouldn't. Something more essential than any of those things. Something you could not document or submit into evidence or record on tape, though Desmond had come closer to capturing it than anyone else had managed. He tried anyway in the plain language he had learned to use from listening to his grandfather. We're okay, he wrote, more than okay. We built a place that's ours. I think that's what he wanted. I think that's what he was trying to tell me all along. He sealed the letter and walked it down to the county road to leave in the mailbox. It was a cold morning, the ground frozen hard, his breath visible in the still air. The trees were bare and the sky above the ridge was the pale, clear blue of deep winter, and the light on the mountain above him was sharp and clean and honest. He stood at the mailbox for a moment, just stood there in the cold and the quiet on the road his grandfather had driven on his way up to the ridge in the years when he was building it, a road that now led to something Callum had built with his own hands on his grandfather's foundation. In the courtroom, he had watched Harlan Voss walk out with nothing. He had watched the consolidated timber subpoena waiting for him outside a man who had spent an advance on land he never owned and could not pay it back, walking into a financial reckoning that was entirely of his own making. Callum felt no satisfaction in that. He felt nothing toward Harlan Voss except a kind of quiet, settled acknowledgement. There goes a man who chose to build his future on someone else's foundation, and there is the cost of that choice. The world had recorded it. That was enough. He turned and walked back up the road toward the cabin. The smoke was rising from the chimney in a straight, unhurried column, the way smoke rises on a still, cold morning when the air has no argument to make. The windows caught the low winter sun and held it. The porch, the east-facing porch, ran the full width of the cabin's front face, and he had built it solid, had built it with the same attention to grain and load and the long-term consequences of small decisions that his grandfather had tried to teach him when he was 10 years old and standing in a workshop that smelled of cedar and linseed oil. He climbed the porch steps. His hand rested on the railing for a moment. It was good work. It would hold. He had built it to hold, and it would hold for years after both of them were old, long after the first season was a memory, and Wren's competition letter was faded on the wall, long after the garden had established itself, and the access road had been properly graded, and the ridge had grown familiar enough that he could walk it in the dark. Through the window, he could see Wren at the table drawing. She was bent close to the page with the focused attention of someone doing exactly what they were made to do. And the light came through the south window at the low winter angle and fell across her work. And the cabin was warm and the fire was going, and on the wall beside her, the framed letter caught the light next to the photograph of two young people who had not known, standing in front of a camera in the bright summer of their lives, that what they were beginning would end here in this. He opened the door and went inside into the warmth and the light and the sound of his sister's pencil moving across paper into the life they had built from a map and a key and a dead man's absolute faith that they would find their way to it. The door closed behind him. Outside, the ridge held its ground in the cold and the quiet, the way it had held its ground for 100 years before either of them existed and would hold it for 100 more. It did not need them to last, but they were here, and what they had built on it would stand.